Welcome to the Florida Bar Tax Section Podcast. This podcast is a production of the Tax Section of the Florida Bar. The audio recordings include free telephone CLE programs put on by the section, as well as other programming produced for you, the podcast audience. If you like what you hear, please rate and review this podcast in iTunes or wherever you listen. Nothing in this podcast is legal advice. Please seek counsel of your own choosing before making decisions that impact yourself or your business. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to the Florida Bar Tax Section's Hall of Champion interview series. This would be the third interview in this series where we are talking to people that have meant a lot to the development of the tax section over the years in the state of Florida and to the practice of tax law in general. And our guest here today, which we are honored to have, is none other than Bob Panoff. And if you're working in the world of tax law in the state of Florida, you have certainly heard of Mr. Panoff. He practices in Miami, Florida, through Robert E. Panoff, PA. And his areas of practice are civil and criminal tax litigation at all levels of the Internal Revenue Service and in court. He also does things like voluntary disclosures, strategic analysis, compliance investigations, and all related matters. Basically, if you have a tax problem, Mr. Panoff can help you with it. He has also done a lot to help the development of the professionalism of tax law in the state of Florida. He's written a lot, he's spoken a lot, and he has been teaching at the University of Miami School of Law for 25 years. So, with that introduction, Mr. Panoff.
Good morning.
Welcome to the interview series.
Thank you.
So, we do very much appreciate having you here, and I know I've just scratched the surface of your bio, so let me sort of ask you this question to help start filling in any blanks in the bio that you'd like to. How in the world did you get into tax law?
That's an interesting question. In law school, I liked the Uniform Commercial Code, constitutional law, and tax law the most of all of the subjects, and was sort of torn between three lovers. And Soya Menchikoff, who was then the dean of the law school, and I were friends, and she wanted me to be a special assistant to Nicholas Katzenbach at IBM. And I interviewed at IBM, and I was sitting there, and behind me there were, I believe it was about 8 volumes entitled Employee Behavior Manual. And I asked the interviewer, does that just apply for when an employee is on campus at IBM, or does that apply for on campus and off campus at IBM? And does it apply to all types of employees? And he said, well, first, it generally doesn't apply as much to salespeople because we recognize they need more behavioral flexibility. But it does apply on campus and off campus. Well, at that point, I don't remember the exact sequence, but at that point, I believe I said something like, I don't think this fits me at all. And I politely excused myself. So that took care of the UCC part of it and related commercial part of it. The other part of it, the constitutional law part, there was a federal district judge who wanted me to clerk for him, who had a lot of constitutional law issues, and that was outside of Florida, and it was very interesting, but I don't like cold weather very much. And then in December 1975, I was the only student invited to a Christmas party for Phil Heckerling was there, Professor Alloway was there, Professor Hausler was there. It was at Professor Alloway's condominium in Key Biscayne, and I came through the door, and I forget who yelled it across the room, but they were sitting there in a festive mood and said, oh, it was Phil. Phil yelled across the room, you're working for my son's firm. And I said, I haven't met them yet. And he said, it's just a technicality. And his son's firm was Schwartz, Nash, Heckerling, Tesher. and Phil became of counsel, I think, a bit later. So I said, I'm willing to meet them. So we went out to dinner at then Size Rivergate, and the dinner was a lot of fun. There were 4 of us at the dinner, 3 of the partners and myself. And it was a tremendous amount of fun, so I accepted, and the arrangement was to clerk. It ended up being about 30 hours a week, and then I took the LLM program at U of M full-time, the LLM in tax. So I had a total immersion in the tax law while I was clerking and at the same time taking the Master's in Tax program. And I really, really enjoyed it. I just fell in love with the practice. And at that time, they taught me everything. Ben was an expert in international taxation and estate planning drafting. Marty Nash was an expert in partnership taxation and planning and tax litigation, civil, and somewhat estate planning also. In fact, Marty was one of the original inventors of the partnership freeze, believe it or not. I think he was there before, I think it was Merle Abbin. And it was a complete immersion, and I did very well and chose to stay in it. And then in June 1980, I went out on my own, a single-person PA, which I still am, and fairly quickly criminal tax issues came up, so I'm self-taught in that area, and it's worked out very well, and I'm still happy.
Well, that's a lot to say. Having been practicing on your own since 1980 in this area, you may have sort of answered it already with the narrative that you just gave us, but I'll ask this question anyway. When I think about you and your practice, I largely think of, frankly, criminal tax matters and high stakes tax controversy. That's a pretty unique, at least from my perspective, specialization when it comes to tax law, because you have, I would say, the vast majority of LLMs and people that practice in tax are primarily planers, and I don't really consider myself in that category. I come to both state and federal tax matters from a controversy perspective. So it's interesting to see people like yourself that, at least at a perceptual level, seem to be very immersed in the controversy side. So if that perception is true, that you primarily are in it on the controversy side, how did you gravitate towards that? And if I'm wrong in that perception, please let me know.
Well, as I mentioned, I was trained to do the planning also, and I used to do the planning, and I did some planning when I went out on my own. But to be honest, it didn't have any adrenaline hit. It was boring. So I can still do it if I chose to do it, but I just think it's a bit boring. I do find it interesting to review other people's plans, which I have been hired to do on a confidential basis, and the planner does not know I'm doing it. Because what I have frequently seen in my 40 years of practice is an office person doesn't understand the real meaning of evidence. Some do, but many do not. And they will plan something that is not realistic within the context of the type of evidence that has to be presented to prove it if it's challenged. So the skeleton might be there, but the blood vessels and the organs and the muscles aren't. And in some cases, there's sort of a Frankenstein plan where everything's there, but it's not very good looking. It may not hold up under pressure. So I've been hired to take a look at it and see, to be candid, does this work? If it does, if the structure can work, is the planned evolution of it and use of it such that it will continue to work? And what has to be done on a review basis, perhaps annually, to make sure it continues to work? And then if it doesn't work, is there something else that you can suggest to tweak it or do something to it that will make it work? So that's sort of fun, and that's got some adrenaline in it. Plus, I'm not the primary planner. I won't do the planning. Among other reasons, I like the surgical approach, meaning in and out like a surgeon.
You know, that's an interesting distinction there, and I've heard that before. Of you can sort of categorize lawyers, and you can categorize lawyers in the tax context, and I think in other contexts as well, as to whether they would analogize themselves to a general practitioner, you know, that looks at the whole picture of a patient over time and is with that client over time, versus a surgeon who's in and out fixing a.
No, I didn't mean it that way, because in order to assess in order to do what I just described, you have to have a complete picture. So what I do is I take a very complete picture. One of the things I'm known for, if you inquire of people, is extremely thorough on fact-finding and eclectic. It will not just be facts that a typical lawyer would delve into. My knowledge base is very broad, and I think that one of the reasons sometimes planning is not appropriate or fitting for a client is the planning attorney hasn't done that. They really don't know the client in the real sense of that word. They haven't drilled down to see what is the client and her or his business capable of on a day-to-day behavioral basis or going forward, and who else in the family is capable of it if that person becomes sick, disabled, or dies. I've seen situations, it's not uncommon that after the primary client dies, the whole thing falls apart because nobody's there capable of dealing with what's been created.
Is there a particular set of strategies that you use in order to elicit that type of information? And I ask that because what I found is that, at least in talking to people much more experienced than I am in this area, especially in the estate planning arena, that getting people to open up to you and tell you the real truth about their situation is truly key in that fact-finding mission.
You mean establishing rapport and empathy?
That's right.
Right.
So do you think
I was a dual major in undergrad school, bio and psych, and I've kept up with science and the psych over the years. I do extensive reading and have developed various interview techniques through the years. I have a very, very good working knowledge of body language and all of the subtle reading tools. And I use humor a lot. Humor adjusted to and fine-tuned to the person sitting in front of me. And the humor generally relaxes people. So there's no one-size-fits-all. There's no one tool that fits all. It's a matter of 40 years you learn to adjust, see what works. And sometimes it can't be done in the first interview, either in the estate planning context or in the controversy context. Frequently in both contexts they come in, if they're higher net worth individuals, they might be somewhat guarded, and they might be thinking, why should I trust this person? I don't even know them. So establishing trust has to occur. Part of establishing trust is indicating that you've been somewhere and done something, and you're not just a schmendrick sitting in front of them, and that they can identify with you. Once they start to identify with you and say, hey, this guy gets it, I can see what he's about, meaning the client thinking that way about you, they tend to be more comfortable and open up. Now, admittedly, it's harder for younger people and older people. It's harder. It is. Psychologically, it's harder. It's harder for me to do that. Because I can tell in a heartbeat when I'm in front of a younger person. You can almost feel it. There's almost an aura of naivete and, to some extent, ignorance. And I'm wondering, what does this person have to offer? And I'm sure that that's a frequent feeling for an older, experienced, successful person when they're sitting in front of a younger person. On the other hand, when you get a younger person that clearly has a spark, that there's something special about them, that's special, and you can sense it.
That's incredibly valuable, and one of the reasons that we're doing this series is to more widely disseminate the wisdom of the people who've been around and done something, to those that are still self-defined as coming up in the profession, and I would still include myself in that boat. With that as sort of a bridge, let me ask you this: you looking over your long list of things that you've done, you taught from 1981 through 2006, 25 years at the University of Miami LLM program. You taught a lot of things there. One does not teach for 25 years without having a really deep-seated reason for wanting to invest in the next generation. So what led you to start teaching at the program, and what kept you in it for 25 years?
Well, I think the tax law is unique in terms of its breadth and depth and complexity. And what tax law does is it attempts, not perfectly, but it attempts to overlay the behavior of people and entities in the United States and outside the United States also to some extent. And I think it's center. I mean, the death in taxes saying is true. It's a central life thing that taxes are going to occur. But underneath taxes are all the other areas of the law. And to be I believe I said this in each of the 25 years I taught, I would tell my people, a tax lawyer is an attorney who knows the tax consequences of what is being done, which means you need to understand as much as possible all the other areas of the law. So I've tried to keep up through the decades on many other areas of the law because of the interaction. And to the personal injury attorney on their 45-foot fisherman, that probably seems a little nerdish and crazy, but I actually love the practice of tax law, and I love sort of being between what we do, all of us as people, and the taxing authorities, and being in the middle of that and trying to allow the us to keep the hard-earned money we've made as much as we can, because underneath that view is a view that the government tends to be inefficient, and I don't see that getting better anytime soon. So I'm a strong believer in private charity, and I try to be charitable, and I think that it's fine for people to keep lawfully and ethically, keep as much of their money as they can under the existing tax law. So it's sort of a mission, and I wanted to do my small part in ensuring that there are a group of people going forward that are capable of being, once again, in between the us and our money and the government and their desire to get as much as they can of it under the existing tax law.
Yeah, that's excellent, and I think a better credo for the mission of tax lawyers in general couldn't be articulated. So I appreciate that.
Thank you.
I also appreciate the fact that you've tied tax to everything else that goes on, because that makes me feel like I'm not insane for seeing tax consequences everywhere I go, and for feeling that the tax work that
people. I'm frequently asked, why is the tax law so complex? And there really is a simple answer to that. We live in a free society where behavior is diverse and evolving, constantly evolving. And the tax law is constantly playing catch-up because of that. Now, if we lived in a dictatorship where behavior was restricted and limited, the tax law wouldn't evolve, or it certainly wouldn't evolve as fast. And the tax law probably wouldn't be as complex. So one of the costs of freedom, and to me, an appropriate cost, is some complexity in the tax law. I think it's a sign that we're still free. And anyone who really understands tax law and the constitutional limitations knows that a flat tax is technically impossible because cost of goods sold is constitutionally mandated and other things are constitutionally mandated. So on a simple level, say with a W-2 wage earner who doesn't have, who now will have the $12,000 a year standard deduction, it can be simple. But as you go up, you can give a good example, and the one I use frequently with people when they ask me about it. Say you have someone who makes widgets, and they're only making, and the profit margin is very slim, and they sell a lot of widgets, so they do make a profit. Well, if you had a flat tax of, say, 5%, how's that going to work? They can't be in business. So the idea of the flat tax and the making something simple, to me, has always been, to be put it bluntly, stupid and ignorant about what our tax system is about and what it's possible to do with it and what it's not possible to do with it.
That brings up a question I hadn't intended to ask you, but it dovetails nicely with what you just set up there. In a prior interview in this series, we were talking with Bill Townsend, primarily about state and local tax, which is kind of his deal. But one thing that he mentioned was noticing a shift over time in tax policy decisions, going from and I'll badly paraphrase this, but going from in the past a more policy-oriented, from first principles idea about how the tax system should be set up and setting it up based on that, versus what he characterized as the current more pragmatic view of how does a policy change affect the amount of money in various entities' pockets. Have you seen a similar shift over time, or do you see those things as always existing with each other? And primarily I direct that toward the flat tax idea that seems to come around every so often.
You have to understand some history here to really appreciate what's going on. Prior to the enactment of the 1974 Budget Act, there was no tax expenditure budget printed and published. The tax expenditure budget is the budget that shows what tax credits, deductions, deferrals, exclusion, etc. costs. Before that, Wilbur Mills, then a very powerful congressman, controlled the process. It was very secretive, and he was the czar of tax legislation. But Wilbur got caught with a stripper named Fannie Fox in Washington in a wading pool, in a fountain, and he was disgraced. And around shortly after that, the 1974 Budget Act came in and created a tax expenditure budget. Now, that was deemed to be a good thing because everybody, in one way, but in another way, everybody got in the game. All of the legislators realized, holy moly, this guy's been doing this for a long time. It's like his own private fiefdom. We want part of this. So, and then on the other side, there was Professor Surrey from Harvard who said that the tax code should not be used for social engineering. Things like, for instance, he would have been against things like child care credit, anything that's attempting to manipulate people's behavior through the Internal Revenue Code, which I myself don't particularly like. I think it's inappropriate. I think that people should have to apply for funds transparently and not be able to just take it on a return. But that's a policy fight that has ebbed. If Bill's referring to that policy fight, he's right. It's ebbed. It's not. I would guess that a lot of people today don't even remember Surrey. So then fast forward to the 1986 Internal Revenue Code, Reagan's Internal Revenue Code changes. People always wondered, boy, how did he accomplish that? Well, he accomplished that because, remember, it's after the 74 Budget Act, where the tax expenditure game became public. He accomplished it with a simple idea. We can take all of these tax expenditure items out of the code now and reduced rates. So we did base broadening by getting rid of tax expenditures, and we reduced rates. So for some people, there will be a real change, but overall, it won't be that big a deal, but it looks like a big deal. And guess what, my friends, my legislative friends? We'll be able to sell it all back to them, or most of it. And that's what happened. So if you fast forward to Clinton, for a while, tax planning really took a hit because the difference between ordinary income and capital gain was only 3% until Clinton came in, and I believe it was expanded to 11%. And there was a big cheer in the tax planning community. And of course, there's a different impact timing-wise on tax litigators because they're litigating history. Mm-hmm. Plus, there was still a lot of tax-favored investment litigation around in the late 80s and even into the 90s. So it's to understand what's happening today, what you have today is you don't have someone as smart as Reagan and his people were, but I think that the way they got Congress, at least the Republican part of Congress, to do what they did, someone probably finally said what I just said, or a version of it, something similar or a version of it. Don't worry about it. And that's, remember, on the individual side in this act, some of them sunset. Well, when you have a sunset, obviously there's a place for lobbyists to say it shouldn't sunset. Mm-hmm. And that means political contributions. So, I mean, I know it sounds cynical, but that's the way the system works.
Well, certainly. And, we sometimes have a front row seat to it up here in Tallahassee, at least at the level. Yeah, I really appreciate that background because I would count myself in the group of people who have never heard of Professor Surrey, but now I'm interested to go look at him.
He was really a powerful person and the lead tax policy person for many, many years. And he was right. I mean, the Internal Revenue Code has gotten muddled up with all sorts of gimmicks. Look what happened when they put the refundable credit in. There was enormous fraud, and there still is enormous fraud. It's making a refundable credit where someone doesn't have to send in a formal application and have it reviewed. You just send in a return. You might as well just put a sign out everywhere that says, free fraud money.
I hear you. Let me ask you this. With your start in the world, you started out with a firm, and then you went out on your own, and you've been doing that a long time. With that experience, looking back, what advice do you wish someone had given you when you started practicing?
I don't have an answer for that one because, I was a bit older and I understood business. I didn't go straight through school, so I had worked in a lot of jobs prior to law school. I did my 6-month stint in the military for National Guard. So I had a lot of experience, and I knew how to run a business. My father had a family business, and I worked in it from the age of 8. So when I went out on my own, I was pretty confident that I knew how to set it up. I had a pretty good business plan or professional plan, and it worked. I think the advice I would give people would be, if they don't have that kind of experience, get it. Don't think you can just open up a shingle on your own and not have any skill set. It won't work. Or it might even be worse than that. You might be so overwhelmed and anxious and confused that you're going to commit malpractice. You have to have systems. So the first thing is to learn the basics of, it's a profession, but it's also a business in terms of you got to have cash flow, you got to pay your bills. Hold on a minute. Sorry.
No problem.
Let me turn it off. Sorry, I'm sorry. So you have to know how to, basically, even if you're a solo, it's still a business as well as a profession. You have to know how to run it. And you have to know how to deal with clients. You have to know how to tickle stuff. I think that I've seen young people go out on their own or go into small firms, and I think they're completely clueless about how to do that. And they're certainly law professors are part of the problem too, because I don't think most law schools prepare someone to actually practice law. They might prepare someone to learn how to practice law inside a firm, but I don't think that they prepare them to go out and practice law by themselves, or maybe even in a small group.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. There's something to be said with the apprentice model that we had before law schools came on the scene way back when.
Law schools changed a lot from when I went. When I went, it was tougher. I had the paper chase kind of contracts professor. That isn't allowed anymore.
Well, you don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, right?
Yeah, God forbid you test someone's ability to withstand pressure, so that they can withstand the pressure they're going to have to deal with the client and the client's matter. But that's a whole other discussion.
Well, that is another discussion, and I think that leads into one of the questions that we like to wrap these interviews up with, and it's kind of combined with a couple things. And I'll preface it with this. Since you have been teaching a long time, one question we like to ask people that have been teaching is, what lesson do you think is most important for your students to take with them as they start practicing? And that's related to the bigger question of, what, in your opinion, makes a good tax lawyer?
A series of questions. Well, one of the things I tell them is, when you get out there, particularly if you have a family and maybe a young child, you're going to have a devil on your left shoulder that's called needed cash flow, and you're going to have an angel on your right shoulder, which is hopefully the ethical part of you. And you may be tempted, particularly if you have a less than perfect partner supervising you, squeezes you, to listen to the devil sometimes. Don't. It's short-sighted. Listen to the angel as much as possible. And I used to say, I know that's hard to do, but you should, if you want a future where you can be proud of yourself, you're going to have to try to do it. And what makes a good tax lawyer? I'd say someone who really drills down on the facts and has the perception to know what facts to drill down on. And I know that's circular, and a lot of it is based on life experience. And all I can say is, if you don't go broad enough on drilling down on the facts, it increases the probability of making a mistake. And someone with 20/20 hindsight can come in after the fact, and they won't say, well, you were young and you didn't have the experience to see that these facts were relevant. They're just going to say you screwed up. And it can really hurt a young person's career. So the best thing I can say is, be alert, be extremely thorough, and be very careful, particularly with the powerful, rich, charming client, because they've been around the horn. They know how to position people, particularly young people, between them and the government, and they know how to use you as a reasonable cause excuse. And I used to teach this to my students also, and most of them would be a little shocked. And I go, look, they didn't get where they got by being stupid. Yeah, they know how to use professionals, and some of them rabbi shop, or minister or priest shop, depending on or imam shop. And by the time they get to you, they know the right words to say to lull you into perhaps a false sense of comfort. So you've got to stay alert, you've got to be thorough, you've got to drill down, and keep your distance. Don't fall in love with the client. You certainly can be cordial, you certainly can lead them to believe that you like them. Don't fall in love with them, because the moment you get blind to them is when you can get hurt.
Bob, these are serious life lessons. that you're sharing here, and I hope everybody that's listening, especially the younger ones on the spectrum, again, of which I would include myself at this point in life, would take heed. Well, Bob, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate it. How can people find you out on the internet or in real life?
Well, I don't have a web page, but if they go to Best Lawyers, there's a blurb there, and I have all the rating stuff is there, and if you put in my name, Robert Panoff Tax, a whole bunch of stuff comes up.
Okay. Well, we will find something.
The internet.
We got it. Well,
another massive invasion of privacy.
Well, since this is going out via the internet, we'll find something on the internet to link to so that people can find you.
Whatever. If even one person benefits from it, we get one young person, that would be good.
All right, Bob. Well, thank you so much for your time today, and we'll see you around the way.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Florida Bar Tax Section podcast. If you like what you heard, please rate and review this podcast in iTunes or wherever you listen. Again, nothing in this podcast is legal advice. Please seek counsel of your own choosing before making decisions that impact yourself or your business. Thank you for listening.